populace were already swollen by an exponential growth in new membership from the many citizens who had essentially abandoned all hope in the face of inevitable death, in what we might consider as an extremely understandable sequence of decisions. They had chosen to roll the dice on siding with the enemy, something that would be problematic for the defending Imperials, who already had enough to deal with in the form of traitor Astartes and mouth-frothing orcs looking to basically fight anything in sight. But now the exploding numbers of ramshackle human cultists was not something anyone needed at this point from the defenders' point of view. However, their lack of appeal to the populace at other stages of the conflict had largely caused this situation, and so the problem rested entirely upon their shoulders. Unlike the pleb masses, the situation on Vigilus, as dire as it was, had been surprisingly tolerable to the aristocracy though, not seen as being particularly a priority or a threat to the invaders. The nobility had been pretty much left alone, having sealed themselves away behind vast bastion vaults which protected them, and offered little in the way of productive contributions to defenders. So similarly to the traitors, the loyal Astartes who had arrived and others had just allowed them to basically sit out the war so far in their entombed luxury, for they had stockpiled truly immense quantities of supplies, enough that it could have lasted hundreds of lifetimes. All this while the population outside were turning upon each other in the search for even the smallest scraps of sustenance. The nobility felt absolutely no obligation to supply the population with any of their stored supplies, even going so far as to equip high-tech Spira war suits to descend and prey upon the representatives of Mortwald's poorer classes when they petitioned for a fairer spread of resources. So things steadily deteriorated. The nobility were content to remain very comfortable as they waited for this particular storm to pass. Yet the possibility of that becoming a reality was, unbeknownst to the aristocracy, looking ever more precarious with each passing hour. And this did nothing to diminish the expanding forces of cultists who pledged allegiance to either the Tyrannid Worm Cult or the Chaos factions, and who were also making a lot of noise in their surrounding areas. Even their own peasantry were putting forward representatives who were successfully causing unity in the cults and then triggering uprisings about the lack of base resources for their survival. It was a vicious cycle. Now, spiras, of course, were normally used for a kind of ritual ceremony in the nobility across hive worlds, but it also is used in a kind of weird sport where spiras can descend to hunt dangerous criminals or just general undesirables. It's grim, distasteful activity that undoubtedly some of the upper class enjoy perhaps a little too much. But now they had been seen to use these spiras effectively in assassinating any of the rebelling populace who got a little too vocal about their wealthy higher-ups and just what they had locked away behind their well-protected inner bastion keeps. But for as fast as the noble spiras could eliminate this leadership, the rioting continued. And to make matters worse, their selfish decadence at the expense of others' most basic needs was causing the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of citizens. In fact, it had become so extreme that it began to attract the attention of not the Imperial Administratum or other senior overseers, all of whom were far too concerned with the other ongoing wider situation. No, they began to attract the followers of decadence, of she who thirsts most. So this situation became a prime example of how Slaanesh can appear not always at those who fall to the most carnal of pleasures. As I've talked about quite recently, Slaanesh is the god of excess, and this can take many forms. A perverse level of selfishness, for example, a sheer abhorrent disregard for the citizens that saw deliberately imposed suffering placed upon others at the unnecessary luxury of the nobility. The actions of the aristocracy in this situation were so egregious they began to attract the scions of Slaanesh to their doors. And with the war raging outside now at its peak, the Astartes on the front lines battling for every scrap of ground they could cover, The planet's militia and guard forces engaged with suppressing the rising numbers of rampaging, rioting cultists that these aristocrats had in large part contributed to creating. There would be none who were available or even aware of the need to now save them. The traitors of the flawless host had quite calmly appeared at the bastion doors, having sensed the depths of human depravity on display, attracted like moths to the lamp. In their acts of self-indulgent, morally devoid, ego-driven suffering which had been inflicted upon the helpless and, in many respects, the innocent, it was enough to attract the attention of the followers of Slaanesh, certainly, but as they would soon discover into their horror, for all the wrong reasons. Because their actions in the eyes of the flawless host were not celebratory, but let's say on the right track. They were leaning toward becoming excessive, corrupt and abhorrent, but in the eyes of Slaanesh their disgusting selfishness was also pitifully lacking. They had walked right up to the door of Slaanesh, but failed so miserably to put on a display worthy of the Dark Lord that more than just being denied entry, their efforts were just offensive. Clearly, they must be shown what was required to satisfy even the most basic desires of the cult followers and scions of Slaanesh. It took very little effort for the aligned Astartes to enter what the aristocracy had presumed to be an impenetrable fortress to the outside situation. And now they would be shown, willing or not, in visceral terms, what indulging in selfish excess truly meant. What followed was apparently so obscene and disgusting to humanity, there exists no record of what was perpetrated upon the lords and ladies of the vigilous aristocracy of Mortwald. Of course there isn't, because it's Slaanesh, as I also talked about recently, but they would be shown with no constraint what it truly meant to experience excess. Slaaneshi demonettes were said to have been seen moving and appearing whenever there were any attempts by guard regiments or cultists to breach or interfere with the prolonged suffering taking place within the private realm of the privileged few. Unfortunately for the citizenry outside, they, of course, gained no advantage from the situation, and while they may have appreciated the ironic fate being meted out upon the elite, such crumbs of comfort cannot fill a bloated, empty stomach, nor could it wet parched lips or soothe infected sheaths of skin. Elsewhere, for those who had maintained enough energy to still display rage at being denied access to resources, aligned cults or just bands of outraged citizenry overwhelmed militia and their defensive blockades, so that in a very short space of time, the heads of their so-called leaders were being paraded, displayed, or otherwise defiled. Vigilus was very much disintegrating in all respects, and so these acts of wanton bloodlust inevitably pulled some into the waiting arms of the dark gods of chaos. The citizenry may have remained loyal had the nobility merely rationed out the more than substantial stockpiles that they had locked away, but instead now hordes of new chaos worshippers threw themselves like some tide of corruption against the Imperials whenever the traitor Astartes would engage them. For the few defenders who remained in Calgar's Imperial Astartes, Vigilus had now reached a terminal inflection point, albeit one which had been clearly approaching for some time. The defenders had been on the back foot already from the beginning. Their forces were minimal and decisions continually bogged down with secondary considerations or delusional hopes of victory. The planet was also ablaze, a vast smog choking the air and atmosphere, resources were sparsely available, and Xenos raiders seemingly could appear anywhere at any time. But throughout the entire Vigilus defensive campaign, the Imperials had really only amassed minimal victories. Many of the original objectives and assets they had attempted to salvage were lost. The spires of the Hives, Dirkden, Mortwald, Dontoria, all were collapsing. The Voidclaw had ravaged the planet's water, among other disruptive environmental consequences which were destroying the planet basically, and the populace felt abandoned and suffered appalling levels of casualty. So looking at the state of play, the despoiler arrogantly began to ignore the Imperials, because in effect he considered the world already his. It certainly seemed as if this were the case, for many of the Imperial's worst fears were becoming confirmed. After the loss of the Blackstone upon the world, reports began to appear that the rift itself was now beginning to steadily encroach toward, and seemingly would eventually swallow, Vigilus into the rift. Astropaths reported seeing lucid dreams and visions of a monstrous hand crushing a throat. The Nachmund gauntlet was beginning to close, just as Abaddon had planned. Few Imperials were under any illusions of the insurmountable obstacles they still faced, but Guilliman had decreed that Vigilus would not fall, and so now they had nothing left to lose. Up until this point, the Imperial defenders had been attempting to spin multiple plates. They were saving the planet, defeating enemy forces, minimizing population loss. Most of these were now clearly unviable, and only a Pyrrhic form of ultimate victory could be entertained. Yet the Despoiler had made a miscalculation in disregarding what was left of the Imperial defenders, for an opponent can never be more dangerous than when they have nothing left to lose. And so now the Imperials would begin to focus and use their forces with little regard for their preservation than they may have before, because many understood that their survival now was very unlikely, something which certainly helped to focus both their minds and efforts. They debated and discussed all remaining options. They looked at further quarantines, the destruction of sites which were on the borderline of salvation or collapse if it meant destroying a number of enemy at the same time. Even the word exterminatus was thrown around. The only positive was that the orcs and cultists of the Pauper Princes had been taking a heavier toll on the Chaos forces. Similarly to the war zone of Octarius though, this really didn't benefit the Imperials in the long term because it simply meant emboldened enemies who would eventually turn upon them, but in the short term it did boost morale incrementally, and it kept the Chaos forces distracted and unable to focus on completely annihilating what remained of the Imperials. Calgar and his Senate, though, still remained, and they had repeatedly made determinations as to the outcome of this conflict. For now, the writing was on the wall. They were so significantly outnumbered, and their existing forces so damaged, that even fighting to the last man would leave them facing total destruction. So Calgar would eventually conclude a course of diplomacy which drew inspiration from his Primarch, for since Guilliman's return to the Imperium, he had made many public displays which made those among the senior leadership very uncomfortable. That is, neutral alliances with the Xenos, namely the Eldari. Calgar had settled on a conclusion that they had never wished to consider, that they needed an unpalatable alliance just as demonstrated by Guilliman to win this war. The Orcs were an obvious non-starter, and despite past historical instances where humanity had loosely worked alongside the Greenskins, usually through circumstance more than diplomacy, the Orcs upon Vigilus were so frenzied that at this point it would be a pointless endeavour and likely end up in just more deaths and waste. Similarly, the Genestealer cultists of the Pauper Princes were so abhorrent, alien, and their overall goals disgusting that to even consider appealing to their kind was both pointless and a criminal step too far. The Imperials would just face death rather than the dishonour of considering the assistance of those wretched mutants. So one option remained, and unpalatable as it may be, the grave situation still existed. The chances of Imperial reinforcements reaching Vigilus were near non-existent, the importance of Vigilus and the Gauntlet incalculable. So the name Eldari was the only one which seemed feasible. The Eldar, though, upon Vigilus, were not those from the more diplomatic and measured of craft worlds. Many of the Imperial commanders and even Calgar's personal guard had already witnessed that those upon the planet hailed from Simhan, who you will remember were present in the early engagements of this conflict. They had approached and descended to Vigilus after their seers placed importance in their great war against the most bitter enemy, Chaos. Now in the earlier stages of the Vigilus conflict, and as humans are not particularly known for their care to discern between Xenos subfactions, the Craftworlders had been mistaken for Drakari, who had already been raiding the world. The then Aquilarian Council, before Calgar had arrived, had seen it appropriate to deploy Imperial Guard against a force that, unbeknownst to them, was likely aiding them. And this caused the death of one of the Eldar leaders, which then triggered Saim-Han to turn upon the Imperials ever since. The outlook was certainly then not helped by the fact that Lieutenant Orthus of the Ultramarines had later been caught up in fighting with the Eldari, having hoped to make some kind of truce with the ferocious yet honourable warriors, but on that day it was not to be, for the Eldar had only vengeance in their mind, and so the Astartes were forced to defend the Vigilus command headquarters from destruction at the hands of the Croftwelders, and this saw only more losses inflicted upon the Eldar, which did not improve relations. But in the time since, little had been heard from the Eldar other than periodic raids and assaults. Still, attempting to form an alliance with Saim-Han remained unlikely at best. But now there was no alternative. By the second night of the immense gravitic forces and Vulian anomaly steadily breaking the planet, and the now encroaching Nachman gauntlet, Calgar knew time had run out. The chattering objections made by career militarum and Senate leadership members echoed still in his mind, as with his Victrix guard by his side, Calgar marched out from the council chambers to where the Eldar forces had been steadily assaulting Hyperia Hivesprawl in recent days. Seemingly, the Eldar remained engaged in this war of vengeance with the Imperials, and were currently fighting against the elite Tempestus and some Sororitas. Calgar approached and found an opportune pause in the engagement. He stood so as to make himself visibly and audibly known to the enemy, for he knew that despite the Eldari still having a score to settle, with the deaths of several of their high-ranking officers, and being also of the more aggressive Saim-Han Eldar, they were also still Eldar, which meant they were intelligent, curious, and open-minded enough to see his presence and consider why he would present himself in this manner, here and now, and that this situation could perhaps aid them in the broader context of the conflict, for they themselves understood the critical importance of Vigilus and the Nachman's Gauntlet. Nothing had changed in that regard. One Farseer, Kaltok, would meet with Calgar, for they also understood that failure for the Imperium here meant to doom the Imperium Nihilus, and with Chaos able to control near 1/3 of the galaxy unchecked, their greatest enemy would reap the rewards, and they would likely face terrifying consequences as well. A ceasefire was called. Within the walls of the Saints Haven Command, Calgar made an impassioned speech that was in places a little heavy on the illustrious praise for the Imperium, Macragge, and the threats they faced, but his mention of an Eldari god of the dead, Ennead, and the priestess who led that cause, Ivrain, this caught sharply the attentions of even the most resistant Saim-Han warriors. The specifics between Calgar and Kaltok were not recorded by Imperial historians, and any other records of this meeting were purged. What was known though is that the Eldar accompanied Calgar back to the Vigilus Senate, the doors barred with his Victrix guard outside, and that from that day forward, notable members of the council were never seen again. The same council members who had ordered the assault upon the Saim-Han, leading to the loss of significant members among the Eldar leaders, which when considered through a narrow lens makes objective sense for the Imperium, but it also aligns with many other uncomfortable historical instances. If we cast our minds back across 10,000 years, it marks just another situation of the Imperium's staunch principles and laws, as dictated even by Calgar's Primarch, only being actually applicable if they are convenient, as was the case upon Terra with the Provost Marshal of the Arbites, Kandawire. She presented Valdor with her evidence of the atrocities committed against the Thunder Warriors, and for her efforts was summarily dismissed. When she refused to abandon her investigations, she was also exiled. So it's well established that despite all the Imperium purports itself to be, this is most often in actuality a gross facade riven with hypocrisy. Anyway, I was very close to going off on a wild tangent there, but the point as always is there are definitely two sides to the Imperium, as we have discussed, two sides to the Emperor. All this though is entirely irrelevant for the likes of Calgar, whose singular objective at this point was to secure Vigilus, not to save it, and to also retain control of what remained of the Nachman Gauntlet, if it could not be prevented from imploding and being swallowed by the Cicatrix Maledictum, that is. So now with their new allies, they set about quickly assessing how they could make the most effective gains against the enemy with the still minimal resources they had available. Now, you can say what you like about the Eldari, untrustworthy, weak in comparison to the Imperials, but when making this alliance, they did not by any means hold back the aid given. One of their very significant loans of hardware was a near to invisible stealth vessel known as Vor's Ghost. This had plagued Imperial shipping in the region for decades. Calgar now intended to use it to launch an intercepting raid against the vengeful spirit. His gamble was that he understood, and perhaps one of the few Imperials here who could understand, the value that Abaddon placed upon this ship. The vengeful spirit held significant value to him, both in its literal strength and power, but also the fact that few ships from this era survived. It was a relic, more of a symbol in this time than it had been even during the heresy, and this had already been well proven in this conflict alone. Its continued presence in orbit had continually intimidated the Imperial fleet enough that they had dared not even attempt further engagements. But it was also a very highly symbolic vessel for the despoiler to control, in the sense that this was the ship of Horus Lupercal, the ship which the Emperor himself was fatefully wounded upon. Calgar well knew there was no possibility that Abaddon would entertain the loss of this vessel, and it was his hope that if they could put some pressure upon the vengeful spirit, it could cause at least some miscalculations, perhaps even the withdrawal of the Black Legion forces, and at the absolute best, perhaps for chaos to leave the world entirely. The new broader strategy they would now deploy involved the highly skilled lightning-fast riders of Sign Han, who would continue on with the Imperial plans of driving their great enemy of chaos to engage against the weight of numbers of the greenskins and cultists. Even though combined, the Eldar and Loyalists still did not have the weight of numbers to contend in any real sense with these threats. But if the Chaos threat could be removed, they would have a fighting chance, and they could then drive the Xenos together. The Iron Warriors had been making steady progress though, breaking through Imperial defences at Mortwald, and presented one of the most heavy threats at the current time. So the Sign Han Wild Riders would engage there first, baiting the raging Orc speed war which had continued on to the rear of the Iron Warriors line, thereby trapping them between the frenzied Orcs and the Imperials. The problem being that the Eldar anti-grav skimmers were so incredibly fast, they regularly had to slow down to enable the Orcs to catch up, but thankfully being Orcs, their enthusiasm to catch the Eldar never diminished. Eventually the merry chase of Wild Riders led the Speedwar to plough straight into the maw of the Iron Warriors, who had been grinding their way into the Imperial lines. At the very last moment, the Eldar Riders flew vertically up, escaping away and leaving the raging Orcs, who had only become steadily more thirsty for a fight, straight into the traitors. This assault and the general strategy was far more successful than they had anticipated, especially when the Wave Serpents of the Eldar led a mass of Orc Blitz brigades straight into the super heavy assets and traitor titans of Legio Decapitorum. Just as Calgar had planned, the traitors were now caught between a single-minded, well-disciplined Imperial line, minimal and thin on resources as it was, and a frenzied, bloodthirsting rampage of Orc insanity behind them. This simple capture maneuver was still only part of the plan. All of this destruction occurring had enabled